I'm Peter Underwood, and this is News from the Water. This year, 2022, is crunch year for Canal and River Trust. It may be another 5 years before the results of the current review of its grant agreement with the government take effect, but the decision is being taken now by consultants and civil servants within the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and eventually in the offices of the relevant ministers in the Tory government. In theory, anything could happen. George Eustice, the former spin doctor and failed UKIP candidate who defected to the Tories and is now Secretary of State, could pat Richard Parry and Alan Leighton on the back, double the grant to over £100 million and hand them the Environment Agency navigations, along with a large gift of land and property to fund their upkeep. He could say the performance of Canal and River Trust over the past decade has been exemplary and a complete justification of David Cameron's decision to get Britain's waterways off the government books and into a pseudo charity where the directors can play the property market and use free volunteer labour without any comeback. He might even add that he agrees with the Trust that it plays a key role in improving the physical and mental health of much of the country, has an exciting future in both mitigating climate change and increasing biodiversity, and if it needs a few £1 million more, it only has to ask. And at the other end of the scale, he could say that hiving the waterways off into the charity sector was always intended to save government money, and now that Canal and River Trust has doubled its investment assets to nearly £1 billion, replaced much of its workforce with volunteers, and clearly has become an organisation much loved by walkers, cyclists, bird watchers and other towpath users, it no longer needs propping up with public money. He might add that, along with every other public organisation in Britain, it will have to play its part in funding the enormous bills of COVID and Brexit. At that point, C&RT's leadership will know whether its massive gamble of the past couple of years, what we might call the well-being revolution, has worked or not. Now, removing priority from maintaining and improving the navigations and placing massive emphasis on selling the towpath as a place to improve the mental and physical health of walkers, runners, cyclists and others, in order to qualify for more government grant, was a somewhat desperate ploy even before Brexit and then COVID came along to drain both the public and private purses of Britain. But stranger things have happened, as the last few years have shown. And a government that spent £37,000 million on a failed and inadequate test and trace system might just find it acceptable to lash out another 50 million or even 100 million a year for a countrywide piece of national heritage, especially if it can claim to be improving the national health. So 2022 could be a year that changes our waterways forever, or it could be a damp squib. We asked some leading boaters who are also keen observers of Canal and River Trust about their predictions and their hopes and fears for the coming year. And it has to be said, there was little conviction that boaters would benefit once the dust has settled on the future shape of C&RT. Alan Richards is a long-term observer of Canal and River Trust and has been paying close attention to the current review, as well as to talking to people within the Trust, and he's some understanding of what is currently playing out in the corridors of power. I spoke to him online. So, what do you think 2022 is going to hold for C&RT, Alan? Are there positives in the outlook?
Positive is that there is the opportunity to secure future funding. But that's also a negative because there is no obligation to increase the amount of grant as set out in the grant agreement or to extend the grant beyond the end of its term, which is 2027. It has always been something written into the original grant agreement that a review will be carried out to determine future funding, if any. So that's both a positive and a negative. If Canal and River Trust gets it right, then hopefully the canals will be secured into the future. If they get it wrong and are unable to convince government that grant should continue, or if the grant is severely reduced, it's going to be big problems.
So are you a gambling man, Alan? What's your bet?
My bet is I've seen some scenarios which go between 125% of current funding, which is about 53 million a year, down to zero. My best estimate, and I think we have to take into consideration that the Treasury will be largely determining, rather than DEFRA, how much it's going to be low. I would say about half current funding, or they might actually pull the plug. I'm hoping that they don't pull the plug on funding, because what that means is that the government have got absolutely no control over Canal and River Trust. They don't exercise the control they've got now, but they might just cast them adrift.
It could be positive or it could be negative. Unfortunately, my best guess is that they'll halve the grant. I'm hoping they don't take it away, but you can't see that the state the country's in, the Treasury saying, "Oh, we'll throw them a bit more money." I mean, the Treasury will say, "Well, everybody is in the same boat." You know,
Yeah.
We've all got to make do with what we've got.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you can see in a way why they went for this well-being thing. If they can make the argument to the Treasury that it's going to save money on NHS bills because people feel better when they go for a walk by a cut, or it's going to help land drainage or move water about and all those sort of things, you can see why they could imagine that argument might carry some weight, but I don't see any sign of that happening.
No, I don't see that happening, because from the government's point of view, is you can go to the local park and feed the ducks. You buy water.
Yeah.
And the fancy figures that Canal and River Trust are coming out with in terms of numbers, when I looked at their figures, they've got a year-on-year decrease over 4 or 5 years in the number of people visiting. They solved that by using a different method to calculate, which more than doubled the numbers overnight. How can DEFRA or the government make sense of public benefit when they're being given stuff like that?
Or trust them, I assume. When I spoke to Marcus Trower, who's a long-term officer of the National Bargee Travellers Association, and holds posts at both national and London level, he was unimpressed with the way CRT has moved the focus away from its navigations and those who use them.
Definitely their priorities of spending money is incorrect, I would say. I mean, they spend so much money on thinking up new ways to make our lives just a little bit harder. You know, concentration after another, different ways of managing. I mean, since CRT's come in, it's every year every year or two you've got a new thing that they're trying out, and it's, you know, that's costly. I mean, it's costly for their new logo that they, you know, a few years ago now they brought in. You know, this just continuous shake-up of CRT, it does cost, well, I mean, they could be spending that on a lot of things, you know, a lot of things that would benefit boaters, but also other users.
Yeah. I mean, especially in London. I mean, you've seen, I mean, I found it almost impossible to get proper numbers from them, but you've seen the amount of facilities go into decline, despite all these promises about more and better facilities for London boaters.
Definitely compared to what it was like under British waterways, and I'd say definitely compared to the amount of boats that need them. You know, the great amount of people giving a greater amount of license fees, you would hope for a better service, but you know, it's quite the opposite. And it's not just a London thing. You travel around the network, all over the place. You've got bins being taken away, or water points, or, you know, overflowing bins, and even in the most smallest areas where you would think, well, why is this overflowing? Well, can't they? They sort it out. But yeah, I think they've got different priorities. I mean, I suppose it'd be interesting to know what the government's wanting. And obviously those other initiatives haven't worked. So where would he be looking now? And if the money goes down, you know, the grants doesn't, I think it's pretty sure they'll come towards us. And, you know.
Oh yeah, I think boaters will certainly be one of those targets. But I think what we may also see is what's already a slow decline of the waterways infrastructure becoming a fast slide towards actually closing, you know, more remote waterways, not repairing them, not keeping the place navigable.
Yeah, I mean, if they're able legally, or if they feel that they can get away with it, then yeah, I mean, like the boats facilities is, I suppose, in one sense, a small example of what could, you know, would happen. But I mean, you know, where they say that it's too costly to keep something open and then shut it, then yeah, why wouldn't they do that to waterways?
I asked Alan Richards about the possible positives for CRT in the current review. But, I mean, if you were a total optimist, I suppose you could hope that CRT would come out of this review not only with a big lump of money, at least as much as they have now, but also with additional responsibilities for the Environment Agency waters.
Well, it's very difficult to get a handle on what happened last time round with the Environment Agency, because Canal and River Trust did make a play for getting that. They actually went to government and said, we will take this over. We're happy to, but I think there's two things coming out of it. What they wanted was more property, which they could use to run the Environment Agency's waterways. They didn't want government to say, oh yes, we'll give you 10 million a year or whatever. That's one thing. The other thing is, I think it became very, very clear that with the Environment Agency's waterways, it's difficult to separate the flooding part, the control of flooding, from the navigation responsibilities. Who is going to? Sorry.
So what's your bet about what will happen with the EA's waterways?
I don't think they'll transfer. I think the difficulty with the EA waterways is that things like towpaths are not there in places that weren't needed, etc., and therefore, the rest of the public thing, there's not so much public benefit for running for running them.
Yeah.
But one of the things that will come out of the review is that the government realised that things have changed since 2012, and there might be benefits that weren't thought of, or benefits which were thought of that have disappeared. So a lot of it will, I suspect, come down to what government's post-COVID strategy. And I think DEFRA, because of this current review, are trying to get a grip of Canal and River Trust and having difficulty. The trustees just aren't taking part in the review. They've just delegated it, and it's sort of 3 or 4 directors plus whoever they want to bring in to answer whatever questions there are. So it's difficult. It's difficult.
So coming back to looking towards this year, I mean, is that a lesson they're going to learn? Are we going to see the end of this fiddling of various details?
I don't think so. I think because DEFRA is aware that this went on, DEFRA will not believe anything they say, but of course it's DEFRA's in DEFRA's interest to make everything look nice and rosy.
Well, not least because it was CRT was their responsibility.
Yes. Well, DEFRA have got a lot of power under the grant agreement. For example, they can take the waterways away from Canal and River Trust and give it to somebody else. They can replace trustees and appoint their own. And I think they've probably gone as far in the grant agreement as they can go to get these sorts of powers without the Charity Commission saying, "Oh, we're not going to register this lot."
Yeah.
From a Charity Commission point of view, they look on DEFRA as a major donor who makes some stipulations about their donations.
I mean, but this all goes. I mean, what I'm trying to go forward, but this all goes back to the job that was done when CRT was set up. There were so many corners cut because it was Cameron's, big third sector project, and it had to work. We've been left with a real dog's breakfast, haven't we?
Yes. Oh, yes. I mean. It's neither one thing nor the other. To my mind, a charity is somebody that's working for public benefit and is largely dependent upon the public to support it financially. With Canal and River Trust, that was never going to be the case because they're talking, 5% of their income from the public. So whether they should be a charity or not is a different matter.
Because given the politics of the current government, the last thing they're going to want to do is take the waterways back into public ownership. You have to assume.
I would think the only way that would happen is if the trustees decided that it was financially unviable. Say government decided, okay, no more grant after 2027.
Yeah.
Then the trustees might say, okay, mass resignations, which then government would have to use its power to appoint people and might take it back into public ownership. But I suppose I can't see it. It's not a practical thing to do, is it?
Well, it's happened with the railways, I suppose, hasn't it, to some extent? But as the whole franchising model collapsed, they're back in the public sector.
Yes, I mean,
and this is a form of sort of charity franchising, isn't it?
Yes, I think it's one of these things where you can get political parties to agree to do something, and it all looks good on paper.
And slow declines very quickly become fast declines if nobody does anything about them.
Yes, I think what will happen is that you will get emergency stoppages on remoter, less used parts of the system, and they won't be attended to.
So the system will start closing down, is what you're implying.
Well, that's right. I mean, we've already seen this on parts of the EA where notionally it's navigable, but because a lock isn't working or something, it's not. And what will happen is the less used things, where there's less pressure, people jumping up and down, will go first.
Yeah, so that's the outer reaches of the BCN. It's probably the Lanky and bits off the Leeds and Liverpool, while the Spring arm is in Skipton has been closed for years, hasn't it?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, there are parts of the system where they know they've got major problems, but they've never done anything about.
Alan fears the lack of grant money, if the review goes against C&RT, will lead to yet another decline in the upkeep of the waterways. And Hazar, one of the leading lights of the National Association of Boat Owners, found it equally difficult to find much positive to look forward to, as C&RT is engulfed in the battle for survival that the grant review may represent. I spoke to her online on board her boat on the Shropshire Union Canal on a poor quality video link.
I can't see that they're going to change from trying to engage the wider public in an attempt to woo DEFRA. So I don't think voter priorities are going to be featuring any more than they have done this year, or last year rather. Well, let's be optimistic here and say that they get a usable grant that is going to maintain the canals and stop them deteriorating any more than they already are. Would I bet on that? Nah. DW at least seem to be more efficient at managing the finances and the maintenance. Is there any chance that we can get rid of CART and go back to a BW system that would at least make the most of any money that they do get?
Well, my understanding of, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, but my understanding of the way CART was set up and what the options are for DEFRA is that, I mean, there are two possible options. If DEFRA don't like what CART are doing, they can sack the chairman and the trustees, and put their own representatives in, although that would give them a major problem with the Charities Commission, of course. And on the other side of it, if CART's trustees don't like what the government's done, they can say, we can't run CART on this financial basis and all resign. And that, I assume, would leave government in a very similar position to having a failed railway franchise, wouldn't it? They'd have to take it back and do something with it.
See it as important enough to spend money on with everything else that's going on at the moment. Again, it needs to be recognised for the incredible, unique heritage that it is. And nobody seems to be pushing that. I mean, CART are just selling it all off.
So Anne Hazard, they're finding it difficult to be positive about the future for boaters. Where will it all end? Like everybody else, I can only make an educated guess, and the picture has become vastly more complicated by the economic impact of COVID and Brexit, to say nothing of a Prime Minister and a government with little in the way of a clear political direction, which seems willing to change tack with every change of wind direction and public opinion as it swings around. Although C&RT has run a first-class social media campaign around its well-being argument, I am not convinced it has sufficient weight of public support for its waterways for it to sway the Treasury into handing over the cash it needs. I am willing to consider the possibility that DEFRA will use the opportunity to offload its navigations without having to provide Canal and River Trust with a large settlement to cover future maintenance, and simply telling the trustees they'll have to manage the Thames, the Medway and the Anglian waterways within their existing grant, which will be graciously extended for another decade perhaps. Now, whilst that would delight some in the IWA who've wanted that for a long time, it raises a massive question mark over the viability of all the English and Welsh waterways, and leaves boaters expecting very large rises in fees. In reality, it's probably more likely that we'll simply face more of the same neglect due to a somewhat reduced grant, and 2022 will bring another compromise that pleases nobody but isn't quite awful enough that it will cost too many votes in Tory constituencies. Boaters will have to keep fighting the same battles with Canal and River Trust, and will see the level of maintenance and provision continue the steady decline of the past decade. Gloomy, I know, but so's life sometimes. That's it. Talk to you again soon.